Hi there. Good evening. My name is Jenny Serene, and I am a finance reporter at Bloomberg News. I'm really excited to be joined today by Peggy Alford, Executive Vice President of Global Sales at PayPal, and Gene Case, Chairman of the National Geographic Society, CEO of the Case Impact Network and the Case Foundation. They're going to be walking you through how they think our economy and our society can recover in an inclusive way. But before we kick that discussion off, I just thought I would share kind of some important facts to really make sure we're all on the same page. I think most of us probably know that more than half of all Americans are employed by a small business, and they're hurting right now. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has actually found that 50%, that's 50, of all small businesses see their businesses permanently closing this year. And three-quarters say they need further assistance to weather this storm. If you zero in on those minority-owned businesses, that percentage increases to 83%. And it's not just their business that's suffering either, it's their health. It's nearly 40% of those minority-owned businesses, they're concerned about the impact of this pandemic on their mental health. It's not just small businesses either. Medium and large enterprises are also trying to find ways to stay afloat. But what's interesting actually is that those companies that have had a focus on improving the lives of their employees, their customers, society in general, rather than just zeroing in on profits, those have actually been performing better during these last 10 months, during this pandemic, than those that didn't have that focus. So I'm really excited to kind of dig in with you guys where we go from here. I'm hoping we can unpack all of this. Before we kick off though, I did want to make sure our audience feels kind of included from the beginning. So I want to hear from you guys. I want to hear. I think we'll have our first Slido question if folks want to turn to that section of their screen. And just give us a sense of where you're dialing in from. We'd love to know. And that will be, the first softball maybe for you, Peggy, or for you, Gene. Where are you guys dialing in from today?
I'm dialing in from Washington, D.C., and it's a delight to be with you all.
Hi, everybody. I'm dialing in from the Bay Area. I'm between San Francisco and San Jose.
That's great. I'm in snowy Brooklyn, actually. Definitely make sure you guys are using this Slido, and we'd love to, at the end, we're hoping to take audience Q&A. So as these ladies are kind of walking us through their big ideas, please, shoot questions. Make sure I want to make sure this is kind of engaging as possible. Great. Well, maybe Peggy, we can start. I have a question for you. I think everyone in the audience probably is very familiar with checking out online and seeing that PayPal symbol. And I know you guys are used by companies big and small. And I would just love for you to give us the lay of the land in terms of what you're seeing, from small business customers, and maybe how that recovery differs or is similar to, the recovery and the patterns of your larger customers.
For sure. Thanks, Jenny. Obviously the theme across all types of businesses is digitization. I think, companies of all sizes and types over the last, call it 3 to 5 years, have had some focus on enabling a digital experience because consumers have started to really require it. But what we're seeing, and there's a McKinsey study that actually demonstrates this as well, is that the McKinsey study says that there's been an acceleration in digitization of commerce by about 10 years just in the last 3 months. And, obviously that's been driven from necessity, as these shutdowns were occurring across the country, across the world. And then we sort of saw ebbs and flows in terms of whether things were even open. There was, suddenly such a need for an acceleration in the focus on digitization. And those companies that had started the journey earlier and were further along and potentially already had online capabilities as well as online commerce, it was an easier shift. But for a lot of these businesses that either had all of their business occurring offline, or they had, only partial capabilities to be able to serve a consumer online, and maybe in some cases not a joining of those two things where they had offline and they had online, but they were sort of separate, that's proved very challenging for small businesses, for all businesses, but specifically for small businesses that have had to pivot so quickly and don't have the resources or the capabilities to do that quickly often. And so that's what we've seen. We've really been focusing on trying to help these businesses not only thrive, but survive what's happened in the last year.
That's really interesting. How do you guys think about, I guess, solving for that delta or helping some of those that might have been slower to embrace that digitalization kind of get up to speed?
Well, as I mentioned, it's been sort of a matter of survival. And so PayPal has really focused on what we need to do to really provide the resources, the expertise, the products to enable this digitized journey. And so one of the examples, we pivoted our strategy early in 2020 to really focus on using QR codes to enable contactless payments offline, and really creating an easy way to integrate those solutions into our PayPal product, other products, as well as the Venmo products. Because consumers, while it was extremely important to do it during the time when everything was closed, what we're seeing is that even as things are opening, consumers are requiring this contactless solution. Nobody wants to go and touch money in the store if it can be avoided. And so we've really focused on these capabilities to enable contactless payment offline, but also trying to help them integrate those in a seamless and easy way, because they don't have time to do something that's going to be heavy or hard to implement.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I feel like, we're all very familiar with seeing you guys in online checkout, but it sounds like we might start seeing y'all more and more kind of in that in-store environment, which will be interesting and curious to see how retailers adopt that and make that all work. Jean, I wanted to make sure to bring you in here. You launched the Case Impact Network in January of 2020, and a pandemic hit, and the U.S. was then engulfed in protest over social justice issues. I'm curious how the last year has kind of informed where you want to put those dollars to work, and if it's changed at all the conversations that you're really having with some of these founders.
Sure. Well, obviously we live in sort of two worlds, the worlds between corporate America, where we work with a lot of corporate CEOs, but we spend most of our time with entrepreneurs building great new companies. And we've definitely seen some of the pain that Peggy talked about. But, our topic is stakeholder capitalism. And if I can take you back just a little bit before the pandemic, it was in August of 2019 where so many companies across America made a commitment to stakeholder capitalism with the Business Roundtable pledge that was taken. And I think that really played a role in our decision to launch the Case Impact Network. And so I spent those early months and really a lot of 2020 just touching base with CEOs, trying to understand how they were going to take what was a good intention into action. And boy, there was a very clear line, Jenny, before the pandemic hit. Almost to a person, the CEO said, look, we're all about this. We've got a lot of work to do. But if there's a disruption in the economy, everyone's going to walk away from stakeholder capitalism. Then the pandemic hit and something very different happened. I think people got up close and personal with their stakeholders, realized that without their employees, they can't keep their businesses open. Without a good supply chain, they couldn't get the things that they needed when some things were in such great demand, looked at the needs of the communities, et cetera. And so although I think there was a prevailing view that stakeholder capitalism would not do well if we were disrupted, from what I'm seeing, it's quite the opposite. And I'm super encouraged by the innovation I'm seeing both from big companies and small companies who are just thinking differently and redesigning a future that will be more inclusive. Stakeholder capitalism is one of those terms people are like, what do you mean by that? At the end of the day, we're really talking about trying to make capitalism work for more people in more places, and the need is still really great.
That's really interesting. I feel like you're right. Conventional wisdom probably would be that when an emergency happens or when a crisis is occurring, it feels like, the focus, you kind of batten down the hatches, and maybe some of these bigger, broader commitments that might take years to accomplish get pushed off the table. So it's interesting that, it sounds like you're hearing then that it's kind of taking on this new urgency. And I'm curious, is there a piece of stakeholder capitalism? I think you mentioned employees. Is that kind of
Oh,
taken
yeah.
center in this
Yeah.
last year? Is there one that you maybe call special attention
Yeah,
to?
there I think are a few examples. I think companies have come to realize that talent at the end of the day is their greatest asset as a company. And without it, they can't thrive. And so we've seen a number of different corporate actions from small things to big things, right? For instance, in the grocery store and some of the frontline places, they increased the wage for their workers, recognizing the extra risk they're being put at. And, some of those same companies have said those increased wages will be sustained after the pandemic. So it's very much of an employee, concern and safety kind of focus and reward focus. But even things like, Lowe's, who basically said we do 100 million in holiday bonuses. We're going to pay those early because we know you really need them in 2020. And Fidelity Investments did something that I know with the young team we have, around us. A lot of them are young parents, and they did something called Caregiving Council, where basically they're helping their employees find access to caregiving when it's very, very sparse, right? Whether that's for senior parents or whether that's for young children. So very much employee focused. And I'll just say one more thing, and then I'd love to hear from Peggy. But I feel like a number of CEOs said, "Gosh, we never realized how hard women have it." For the first time, as they came into the homes and they watched how things happened, and men were put in that same position of dealing with the kids and everything else, there became this awakening of sort of the extra challenges women have had as they've worked.
I think that's such an interesting, I've often been struck. You guys are looking into my apartment right now. I feel like it's been such a weird year where you're literally brought into people's homes and you're just kind of seeing it all happen in real time. I would love to hear, Peggy, how is PayPal thinking about this kind of stuff in terms of, I know you guys have been a real long time supporter of stakeholder capitalism, and that's taken on lots of different shades for you guys, but curious if it's, taken on that new urgency that Jean's talking about.
Yeah, for sure. First, I want to say that I actually, to the point that Jean was making, I have a whole new appreciation for teachers. I already had an appreciation, but I think parents who are trying to work and who are trying to educate their kids at home have a real appreciation for what teachers go through, which I certainly do. I think that to the point around stakeholder capital, I think it's actually such a refreshing concept that we're seeing so much more of, in that companies are realizing that doing good in the world and doing well as a company don't have to be mutually exclusive. And, the other point the great point I think Jean made is that, employees are your greatest asset. And, I think there was a belief that our young employees, are in a different place and they want to make sure they're working for a company that represents their values. I would argue that that is not just young employees. That is all employees. It feels much better to know that you're at a company that is, doing something of value in the world. And I think more and more employees are requiring that the company that they work at is reflective of the values that they hold. And so I think that plays in so well to the concept of stakeholder capital. And I've been super blessed to work at a company where, that has always been the belief. PayPal is built on the belief that financial health and security is an essential foundation that must be in place in order for people to live with dignity. And so we've constantly been looking for ways to democratize financial services and make it more accessible to people of all types of economic situations. And, the events of 2020, both with the pandemic as well as with the some of the horrific racial events that happened in the US, it caused us to say, how can we help in a very new way? We already had, our products and services. We doubled down on how to support businesses that needed to digitize, but we also made a $535 million commitment that was focused on Black and minority businesses and really focused on trying to address and close the racial wealth gap. And, we felt like we had a unique opportunity to really demonstrate what our values are and how we actually put our money where our mouth is. And so, Black-owned businesses, as you mentioned, Jenny, at the beginning, have been especially hurt by the pandemic, both because there's a larger percentage of small businesses, and small businesses were hurt much more than large businesses. But then when you layer on the racial wealth gap and the sort of divide in opportunity that these Black communities have experienced, we felt like we needed to really think about how we address and help in this area. And so our $530 million commitment was really about both addressing some near-term need as it related to these businesses that were today suffering. You can't address the long-term issue when you're drowning in the first place. So we wanted to deploy some capital, some grants to help these small businesses. But we also wanted to think about the race divide and some of the causes for that from a long-term perspective, so that the events of 2020 aren't a point in time and it isn't just like a popular thing to do to address in the short term, but that we're thinking about, Black founders and startups and financial institutions and Black banks in communities and other represented communities. And how do we start to provide the capital necessary to start to address some of these root cause issues of the racial divide?
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating. And I think it would be good, actually. I want to make sure we keep our audience kind of involved while we're still on this topic of stakeholder capitalism. I'd just be curious for you guys to maybe weigh in on the Slido panel. So this concept of stakeholder capitalism that we've been talking about, I'm curious if for y'all, either in your businesses or just in what you guys are seeing, has it taken on a new urgency during the pandemic? Has it had to take a back seat to other, important pressing issues? Or has it just kind of remained just as relevant? Are we in a steady state? So we'll give you guys a few seconds. But I wanted to go back, Peggy. I think it's so interesting, your point about it's not just young employees that kind of demand this from companies. Because I do think that was kind of the rap it was getting for a little while, where, companies saw it as almost like a recruiting tool. Like, I'm doing this because I want to have the best talent, and the best talent demands this. So it's interesting, actually, that, that it's not just like younger people kind of get out of college and making these demands, but it's employees going down the age ladder.
Yeah, and Jenny, it isn't just, who you work for. It's also, I think, the products you buy, where you invest. I really think we're kind of, in the earliest days of a really significant transition. And while millennials, I think, probably raised the consciousness in many ways around some of the things that we're talking about, women have played a really significant role too. And when you put them together, it really is, it has momentum. And again, from, where I sit, I kind of really have seen some bright spots out of 2020 against all the darkness that we've witnessed. I have a local butcher who actually opened his butcher shop the first week of March as the world shut down. Oh. And he was really very concerned about whether he was going to keep that business open, just like we talked about all the businesses that have closed. And he's a Black guy, and he really, really struggled. And then, after the racial justice issues came about, he found that he had people from all over the world ordering his meats because they had seen a piece on, a news program about him being this Black-owned business that was really struggling coming right out of COVID, et cetera. He has people, we're in DC here, and he has people that drive in quite a distance from the burbs just to support him. If you go on Yelp and you want to make a choice, or many of the things that we use to order our food or our products or whatever, today you'll get choices of choosing Black-owned businesses. So we're seeing some innovations that have come forward and some unbelievable care and compassion that I think will be there. Some degree of it will be there when we come out of this pandemic.
That's really interesting. Well, it sounds like you guys have convinced our audience at the very least, or at least they're experiencing similar to what you guys are seeing, that says they also believe that this has really taken on a new urgency during this pandemic. I want to make sure we kind of cover both sides of this coin that the panel is meant to be about. So small business, Peggy, when you're talking to your small business customers about how they'll recover from here, what do they really say they need? Is it capital? Is there some other form of support that they're calling for?
Yeah, I mean, I think it falls in a number of categories. I would say, in the immediate, a lot of these businesses did need capital just to be able to survive. I mean, if you were a small business that all or the majority of your business was done in person, that suddenly you can't pay your employees, you can't pay the rent on your, store or service, the place where you provide your service or product. You can't pay your own bills. And so the immediate need in a lot of those cases was capital. And, that was something that, just with all the inefficiencies of the PPP program early on, became tremendously difficult. And that's why I think, these organizations that, including PayPal, that wanted to provide these grants or other forms of capital were so important in the early days and still remain very important, because as you know, the shutdowns have been sort of an evolving thing. We had, depending on where you are in the country or in the world, things shut down, then they opened up, then they shut back down. There were all types of stipulations even after things opened. And so, it's a continuous problem for a lot of small businesses. I would say in the longer term, it gets to what we talked about around digitization and the need to have solutions that enable you to digitize your products and services, as well as the ability for consumers to find, purchase, pay in a digitized way. And that, sort of spans the entire commerce journey. So it's everything from how do you even attract customers? How do you find customers when you're in a different type of digitized setting than maybe you were in person, to how do I, enable the transaction to happen? How do I provide a seamless checkout experience? How do I involve a payment experience, including all of the regulatory and fraud and all of those complexities? And so, they've really been, especially small businesses, have been reliant on, a consultative approach to handling this whole digitization of commerce. And those that are doing it and finding that opportunity to do that will thrive as we come out of the pandemic, even when things open back up, because I do not think it's ever going to go back to the way it was before. And so I think there's going to always be this sort of blurring of offline and online that we were seeing over the last 5 years really be accelerated into the new consumer experience.
Yeah, and I think what you said was really interesting, Peggy, and I think you're so right about, it's really time to embrace the digital world. When we created AOL, 30 plus years ago, we remember businesses saying, why would I ever need a website? And we're stunned in 2021 at how many still don't have a website. So you're right about that. But I also think another really important component, and it goes back, Jenny, to what you had referenced about, who will close and whether people are optimistic and saying they will have to shutter their business. Hello Alice is a platform that sort of helps new entrepreneurs grow and build their businesses. And they have hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs, most of them women of color or Latino. And, the community aspect is really important right now too, because what we've seen and measured, and particularly Hello Alice has come out with a lot of this data, is that when being an entrepreneur is a lonely job, right? You don't necessarily have a cohort of people who can relate to the challenges that you have. So when you can bring entrepreneurs together in community, just like you, Peggy, they can talk about, well, I did this with PayPal, or, I did this for my website and it made a huge difference. What they're finding is when you have forums where entrepreneurs and small business owners can come together and share, it makes total sense, doesn't it? And share their challenges. They're not only much more optimistic, they're actually surviving longer than those that are kind of disconnected. So I think we sometimes, don't value the role of making sure we have a community come around entrepreneurs and really support them and mentor them and help them along.
Yeah, that's such an interesting that aspect of like you have this really independent spirit and then kind of admitting you need help and coming to a bigger community for that is kind of an interesting aspect to all of this. I want to make sure we get to our last Slido question too. So if you guys are in that section of your screen, been listening to these two for about a half hour now. I'm curious how you guys think we will see a recovery from here. Will it be small businesses getting back on their feet, consumer spending beginning to recover, further government stimulus, or large corporations? So I'll let you guys answer that, and also if you have any Q&A, be sure to put it in. I did want to ask you, Peggy, while we're waiting for those kind of to come in. I feel like I should have given an option, all of the above. But uh, going back to the commitment you talked about, PayPal pledging $500 million to support Black and minority-led businesses, and that's such a big, important commitment, obviously. I'm curious if you think that's the path we'll start to see for some of this recovery, where large corporations are kind of bringing their hand down and making sure they bring small businesses along, or kind of just how you think that these types of commitments, which we've seen a lot of from a lot of different players across corporate America, how do they play into where we go from here?
Well, I think what we see, especially in the desire to support small business, is this sort of joining of small business and consumer, what consumers want, right? I mean, lots of consumers are their own small businesses as well. And I think, small business has always been the bread and butter of our economy. And, I think what we've seen in the last, year is that the most prepared, or maybe the largest companies that have had the ability to pivot their strategy, or have the resources to really focus on quick digitization, have been the larger businesses that have been able to sort of weather the storm. I'm sure they were hurt as well, but have been able to weather the storm a little bit more. But I think that this desire to help small business survive and then thrive as we come out of this is something that will sustain, because I think it's reflective of the way consumers think and what consumers want and how they want to support themselves, their families, their communities. And I think that's what's going to drive the continued desire for both businesses as well as individuals to help these small businesses survive.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's right, Peggy. And I totally agree with you that small businesses are the engine in America. But what a lot of people don't understand is that all new net jobs come from new companies, from entrepreneurs creating startups. And not only net new jobs, but obviously our innovation economy is very much driven by that. And I think we really need to pay close attention to what's happening in that sector as well. Last year in America, 75% of all venture capital went to just 3 places: California, New York, and Massachusetts. And less than 1% went to African American founders, and only 2.2% went to female founders. There's a huge opportunity in the GDP and in our innovation economy. I really consider it an economic imperative that we kind of bring those folks that have been left on the sidelines for too long. We invest in them, we champion their companies, we buy their products. It really is a way that the economy can turn around, and turn around fast if we pivot ever so slightly. And even for those companies, when they have innovations, we'll often see a big company either come into that market or buy them. So even some of the innovations that we see from our biggest companies really have sort of their origin in these startup companies that are really designing a new way forward, and kind of a future that sometimes when you're big and successful, it's not so easy to see a different way.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I'm curious how you think, Jean, how we make sure some of the commitments that we've seen, from companies like PayPal and across corporate America, how we make sure that's sustainable and kind of, just to Peggy's point earlier, actually, going on some of the early grants and really looking at some of these underlying issues that, might take years or even decades to solve.
Yeah, I think some of these are going to be, long-term challenges. And if I'm sounding overly optimistic, I'm just trying to say that I'm seeing the seeds of some good things going forward that may endure. Peggy's very fortunate coming from PayPal, because PayPal is the real deal. I could name 5 things that she hasn't even brought up that are just major that PayPal has done around stakeholder capitalism. But when the companies began making these commitments, particularly to Black-owned businesses or moving capital to those places, I very much engaged with the companies that were doing that. And, one thing we realized was there just weren't the networks, there weren't the connections. So I'm not going to put you on the spot, Peggy, but I can tell you several other companies that made similar kind of commitments. When we talked to them, they said, we just don't know what to do or where to go. Yeah. And so one of the things I think has happened is a lot of us have worked to bridge networks, to introduce new folks. My husband, for instance, in his investment fund, did a pitch competition of all Black entrepreneurs. And I forget, I think 500 applied. And I literally had a CEO say to me, I didn't realize there were 500 Black entrepreneurs in America. And you want to go, come on. Yeah. But the point is, those relationships are established now. There are some bridges that have been built, and that will only be helpful going forward. We can beat people up for maybe not having been where they should have been at the right time, but at least when they're on the road trying to make a difference and they're beginning to build networks, ultimately, I think we'll see things change. There'll be a pipeline of new talent that they'll find. There'll be a pipeline of new deals and people to invest in, and that's got to be good for our economy.
I love those points, Jean. I do think that what a lot of the focus has done has been in creating these networks and these bridges. When we thought about deploying the part of our commitment that related to startups and founders and venture firms that either have Black founders or that are focused on finding the next Black or minority-owned entrepreneur, we had to really use all of our networks to really think about how do we find all of this great talent that exists in the world, and how do we ensure that we're not just continuing to invest in our backyard, because that's what you're most familiar with, right? And so it was very important that the approach is one of partnership and one of, really thinking about what are the organizations that are on the ground across the country, across the world, that can help find these opportunities and these folks that are, that are going to enable us to have a more diverse economy. But I also think that what we found is that for a lot of the small businesses that we look to support, we also look to support them with tools and capabilities, not just capital, but how do you actually help their businesses thrive by giving them access to the tools and the capabilities that maybe they were not aware of and that they could help grow their business with. And so we've really tried to also take a consultative approach. A lot of our legal folks, did, pro bono assistance to, help in areas that, whether it's around corporate law or just areas that would enable the capability building to basically show that these businesses with their amazing services or products could also be thriving businesses with a little bit of support.
Yeah, and even the governance, ESG is so hot right now, right? And, so much money is flowing into ESG, particularly the EFT investments. But the G stands for governance. And, that hits on that spot of how diverse is your company. And, there's overwhelming, compelling data. You mentioned McKinsey earlier, Peggy, but, McKinsey and Deloitte have been out there forever, banging the drum, making it clear that diverse enterprises outperform. The data is very clear. And we know the impact of one person of color or one woman put on a board, how that can change everything. And so these bridges and new networks that are forming, it could be an opportunity to advance, because we've seen what NASDAQ and Goldman and others have done in calling on companies that they're going to invest in or back to have diverse boards. Even at that level, that network, I think, is going to start to pay out, and the leadership will be more reflective, I think, of what we should look like in America.
For sure. And whether you're talking about gender or ethnicity, diversity breeds diversity. So you start to diversify your C-suite, diversify your boards. They have amazing networks that then can help even, accelerate the representation that we have both in the boardroom as well as in corporations. And that enables you to be more reflective of the consumers and the communities that you're looking to serve as a company. So.
Good point.
This is great. You guys are really on a roll. It's awesome. But I wanted to jump in because we do have a few questions from the audience that I think are super interesting. And a lot of them actually center around measuring maybe some of the impact, all of these commitments are meant to have. So maybe Peggy, you could start by talking about, how will you guys assess the impact of that $530 million commitment? Or how will you, I guess, say, okay, that was a success?
Yeah, I mean, I think that first, the commitment that we made, it's multidimensional because it was meant to address a lot of different sort of root causes of where we are today. And so, I mentioned that at the beginning, we were really looking to just infuse capital into places that needed it the most, in small business specifically, Black-owned small businesses. And so there, it's just about being able to measure that we were able to make a difference in terms of the survival as well as the recovery of these businesses. And so it was much more of a short-term, goal. We also, though, we committed dollars to 20 leading nonprofits across the U.S. that are also focused on empowering Black businesses. And each one of those would have a slightly different agenda or focus. But what we were trying to do there was about ensuring that we were thinking about the whole country and not just Silicon Valley where we're headquartered. So there, it's really just about partnering with organizations that are closest to the communities that we were looking to solve, that we were looking to serve, and ensuring that we are spreading the capital. And then, there's the longer term type commitments where, it's not so much about like what is the one KPI that we're going to close, but when you start to think about deposits in Black and community-owned banks, there it's just about like, are we actually getting capital in a way that diversifies? And, that if you just look at, some of the stats that Jean mentioned earlier around, the percentage of, venture capital that goes to Black or minority-owned businesses, very, very small. And so starting to move the needle there was the focus around the investment that we're making in early stage Black, Latinx, startups, venture funds, and then the commitment we made, the larger bulk of it in terms of getting capital into community banks, Black-owned banks, starting to get more of the capital where we're making decisions with the vendors we're using, ensuring that those are, diverse vendors. Those are all individual actions that roll into our $530 million commitment. And each of those we sort of look at, are we actually making a difference? Are we moving the needle? And also, are we inviting others along? Because $530 million, it seems like a big number when you think about it in terms of corporate giving, but it is a drop in the bucket, and it's not going to solve the problem. And so we've really tried to partner with other corporations and other organizations to get even more capital deployed. And that's where I think you start to see some step change progress.
Yeah, I think the question's a really important one, Jenny. I think that in any area where somebody is showing intentionality around impact, I think it has to start with a very clear intention that they're articulating, but then you have to have measurement. I mean, the rule of business is measure what matters. And if you're just throwing money out there without a commitment to say, we're going to understand the difference that was made here and the progress we're making and the impact we're having, it's not real. So it might look good in an announcement, but it really is that follow-up that matters. And the third, so it's intentionality, it's measurement, and it's transparency. Because not only do you need to measure, you need to let the world know what happened. If you're going out there and bannering this intention, follow through with transparent measurement and tell us what happened. But at the end of the day, on a lot of these things, what we really need are some standards to emerge. And today we're pretty far away from having standards that we can all count on. If something says it's ESG, today there's no standard to tell you what's really going on under those three letters and what the company is really doing. So a long way to go, but I think, those three areas, particularly being transparent, is really, really important.
Yeah, I know at Bloomberg we like to always try and demand data, but for some of this, it's not really even a data question. It's like measuring impact is definitely tough. So, Dean, there's a question for you that I think is super interesting. it looks like a really rough year ahead, probably, even after the kind of difficult year we've had. And, what might be some of the collateral damage or things left by the wayside that you're kind of worried about,
Boy,
especially?
yeah, there's one that I'm not the only one worried about it. McKinsey called it an emergency for corporate America, and that is the number of women leaving the workforce. It's shocking. When school started back in September, 865,000 women left the workforce that month. It's estimated that this year it'll be 2 million women leaving the workforce. It's been measured that they have 5 more hours of work between teaching the kids and taking care of the family during the pandemic. All of their support systems dried up. Daycare, family help went into quarantine. We could go right down the line. Schools closing. We didn't realize the role school played in supporting working women. So if there's any one thing, and you asked a question earlier about the GDP and the health of the economy, we started 2020 for the first time. The majority of workers were women at the beginning of 2020. And we were beginning to see some advancements like Salesforce, who just kind of went like that and fixed the gender wage gap problem in one day. So we were starting to see some bright spots, but there's a great concern that we could be set back sort of societally by as much as a decade. But more importantly, women contribute trillions to the GDP when they work. And we really need to be paying attention to this as employers and supporters of women out there to do all we can to keep women in the workforce.
It's really interesting.
Such a great point. And I think that, in addition to the focus that we need to have on the support systems for women to enable them to be able to work, as employers, we need to be thinking about making work worth their while, right? And so if you are, dealing with everything at home, exasperated by everything that went on in the last year, and you're not having an experience that's either equitable or feels like a good use of your time from a career progression perspective, we are going to continue to lose these women. And so I think it just makes it increasingly important for companies to be focused on the progression opportunities for women within their companies.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I hate that we're out of time, because I think this is such an interesting topic, and we could probably go on. And it sounds like it's interesting. We're finishing kind of talking about something where we could be taken 10 years back. We started with this conversation about digitalization and taking this 10-year leap forward. So obviously lots of change and still more change to come. So I really appreciate you guys taking time out of your very busy schedules to have this conversation, and I hope we can keep it going in the future.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Peggy.
So
Thanks, everyone who joined us.
Thanks, Jean.